Welcome to the Rosen Dental Transitions podcast, the show featuring success stories and best advice about buying, selling, and managing a dental practice. Now here's your host, the managing partner of Rosen Dental Transitions, Dave Miller.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Rosen Dental Transitions podcast. Back by popular demand, we have Jon Eskow from the Eskow Law Group with us today. Jon, thanks for joining me.
Absolutely thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me again.
There's kind of checkpoints or linchpins that will stop the process if you don't have some of those initial things going. So I think we both agree that that initial due diligence of, I looked on this on paper, I met the doc, it seemed good, but I want to get in the office and kind of just like reaffirm that I know this is a fit. And that happens a week or two after, within a week or so after you sign the LOI. And then you kind of, like you said, everyone has their foot on the gas to get all of these things done in a methodical way. But I think the biggest thing that can pump the brakes is the financing approval, right? The due diligence is a big piece, but you get to a certain point where it's like, okay, we don't even know if you have an approval yet. Like, why are we, maybe we should slow down on the investments both sides are making and, bringing in a landlord with a lease assignment or, planning to communicate with the staff or whatever it may be. We've got to make sure we have an approval for the full amount that can close and, there's nothing that's going to change this deal, because if it's candidly, if you're a buyer and it's a competitive situation and the bank says we can't finance the whole thing, they may have 4 or 5 other buyers that can, and it may cost you the deal. So
I think, and something just crystallized when you were talking through that last point, which is that there is a difference, a big difference between starting things in tandem and moving various streams forward in tandem and rushing through something, right? And doing everything at once. Those are 2 very different things, right? I think what we're saying, and we should probably clarify this, I think what we're saying is that you shouldn't look at the process linearly, right? Because a lot of points in the process, whether it's the real estate piece, the bank piece, the legal piece, the diligence piece, kind of interact, right, in different ways, and ways that are subtle and ways you may not fully understand. And so the best approach forward is to actually start things in tandem. That may mean that certain things go a little bit ahead and then certain things get held back and then there's a catch up. It means that you're just being thoughtful about the process and making sure that the various streams are moving forward so that you can make those educated decisions and evaluate kind of cost-benefit analysis once those pieces intertwine together.
yes, that's exactly right. It shouldn't be chaotic in terms of how you're moving forward of like, oh, I'm just, doing all of these things haphazardly because I have this huge list. It's, it's almost like you're a conductor of the orchestra, and, your attorney and the lender and the broker and maybe your consultant or whoever are all playing different roles in this masterpiece you're trying to put together. Maybe a little hyperbole with the masterpiece there, but, that's, everyone kind of has their part, and you guys need to be working in conjunction to make sure that you're putting together something that is going to be good compared to everyone like operating in a vacuum. And you're like, oh, well, I didn't even know that the bank wasn't approved, or I didn't know that the approval was for $50,000 less than the asking price or whatever.
Sometimes the music sounds better when the violin and the flute and the cello are all playing together.
There you go.
Right? And sometimes there's solos. Mm-hmm. Right? So let's just, we can riff off of metaphors all day long.
Big metaphor guy. All right, so you get the offer accepted, you get into this due diligence process, which is, as we've talked about, multiple streams kind of interacting and running and at their own pace, but also relying on milestones from each of the other ones, right? Like, there's going to be points where your attorney is going to ask about the financing or the due diligence, and are we clear with that, and have we passed those things? And so you get to that point where, all right, due diligence, everything passes the test. I don't have any other questions about the practice operationally, so we can kind of cross that practice due diligence off the list. And then the legal documents get to the point where all of the major deal points are ironed out, and you're kind of getting towards basically you're starting to plan closing, right? We could be 2 to 3 weeks out. Obviously, there's some transactions where you're working on the contract 5 days prior, but the reality is the banks need lead time to close. You can't just come to a bank and say, hey, we want to close tomorrow, right? You have to schedule it with them. You have conditions. You have to satisfy the loan. They're going to need to review all of the documents. So you usually need to provide them 5 to 7 days of lead time. So as we're coming down the stretch for closing, there's a number of things. From a legal perspective, you have to get, entities and waivers and exhibits. I mean, what are some of the stuff that you see as you're coming down closing that are the recurring themes of like maybe sellers or buyers put them off to the last minute, or things that come up and you're like, hey, we've been talking about this, we've really got to get this done. Are there recurring themes that you see that people could be more proactive on that would help with deals?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's nothing, I would say, it's kind of like a hodgepodge, I would say. There's no magic, bullet out there that I'm like, oh, if everyone just did this one thing earlier, like the world would have peace, right? Maybe that's hyperbole as well. But I think the reality is that the biggest thing that I think needs to be addressed earlier on in the process, and then I'll get into some legal things, but this is more of a transition thing, is like coming up, having both the buyer and the seller on the same page with like how the transition's actually going to play out, right? When is the meeting with the staff going to take place? What's it going to look like? Who's going to be there? Is it just the seller to start and then the buyer comes later? Is it both the buyer and the seller, right? Like that piece, I've definitely seen some, the later you get in the process, that can create some anxiety, some frustration, some agitation, right? Going into closing. I'd say from a legal standpoint, it's the small stuff, right? It's like the small stuff builds up, right? So it's developing that, the different exhibits of these are the assets that are included. These are the assets that are not included. It's the things like running accounts receivable reports, right? It's the things like saying, okay, there's these 20 cases of work in progress or treatment in progress. This is how we're going to handle that, right? It's kind of some of the smaller things that ultimately add up. I mean, by far the biggest headache trying to do it, at the end of the process is the real estate. Yeah. If there's a third party landlord, because, you talked in the beginning about the different kind of constituents in a deal. The only part of this, or the only constituent in a deal who literally has no vested interest in the deal happening is the landlord. They could care less, right? So if that landlord is like on a 2-week safari, right? Like it doesn't matter. They're not going to be like, oh, well, let me, leave my safari and go look at a lease assignment document, right? They're going to say, yeah, we'll get back to you in a week and a half when we're back in town. And it's like, well, we're supposed to close in a week. What am I supposed to do? And it's like, well, not my problem.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that the biggest stress, I would say, heading into closing in that last mile is probably just making sure that the real estate is squared away the right way.
Yeah. Yep. I think that's a huge, and that's one thing that if you're a seller and you don't own your real estate, I would highly recommend pulling your lease out, looking at your renewal options, looking at your rates, talking to a real estate professional like Car Healthcare Realty or one of those that specializes in dental to make sure that your lease is set up in a way that will be, again, you can't go no risk, but minimize the risk when the transition happens in terms of whether it's a lease assignment or someone's going to have to negotiate. Just at least know what lies in front of you.
Yeah,
right?
Because look, we're doing a deal right now where we've got a seller who has a lease with like 6 months of term left. Well, like a buyer can't buy that practice without doing a pretty healthy and intensive extension with a landlord, right? Not just in terms of length of time, but also in terms of rent. And like, that's a much different situation than for someone who's coming in saying, hey, there's 10 years of term left or 5 years of term left on the lease, and I can look out and know where I'm going to be for the next 5 years and what my costs are going to be, right? And
well, we're dealing with two right now. One where they went to renew their lease and the landlord said, hey, I'm redeveloping the property. I'm not going to give you a renewal. And so they have 2 years left and they're nearing retirement. So they don't want to borrow $700,000 and expand their office. So they're selling early because they have to really find a merger situation and go into another office. We have another one where the doctor thought they could extend their lease and they went to the landlord and they said, hey, we didn't hear from you. So we signed a lease with another tenant. And so you got to be out in 2 months. And so that practice isn't really so again, it just goes to being proactive on the real estate side and kind of knowing what you have.
Well, it's interesting. You just took, we've been talking about like the last mile, right?
Yeah.
The last couple of weeks. You just kind of took real estate and brought it into the very beginning of the process, like before letter of intent, before offer letter, right? As a seller, you've got to make sure that like there's not going to be some like crazy catastrophe that happens, that is that you don't know about, right? Like, can you imagine getting, a letter of intent signed and having a buyer due diligence and going down the process and being like, okay, well, now I think we're far enough along that it makes sense for us to talk to the landlord, right? Both sides have spent time and money, and then all of a sudden the landlord was like, great that you guys want to do this, but like, you can't do it here.
Yeah.
Right? Because I'm redeveloping this space and it's going to happen in 6 months and then you're out. And it's like, wow, like that's a whole lot of time and effort and money that's spent. And Dave, you guys would have marketed the practice completely different.
Yeah.
If you knew that was going to be the case.
100%. Yep. You're exactly right. I think there's certain things that, and again, we go back to, we do valuations and all that kind of stuff. And it's all about knowing what your options are, what things you should do now so that when the time comes, when you're ready to retire, you don't have any of these surprises that, cut the value of your practice in half or change your timeline or whatever it may be.
You and I have talked a lot about planning ahead in various contexts when we've when we've been talking together or in front of kind of groups of people. And I think on both sides, planning ahead is probably the single biggest indicator of a deal moving forward successfully, right? If you're a buyer, right, make sure that you want to buy a practice, right? Like there's plenty of other opportunities. There's no harm in being a career associate. There's no harm in partnering, and you want to be a partner in a practice and have someone else be a co-owner. That's great as well, right? You want to do a startup, right? Or a de novo practice. That's another great opportunity. There's a lot of ways to be a buyer and to own your own practice or to just have the type of clinical autonomy that you want to have. But don't figure that out, on the 10-yard line when you're trying to close a deal to acquire a practice. Be like, I'd rather just, I think I'm more of a startup type person, right? Yeah. Or on the flip side, if you're a seller and you really don't want to work after closing, you want to just kind of hand the keys over to the buyer. Like, don't go through a whole process where you're being a big part of the deal is you staying on to work for a period of time, right? And really have those hard conversations with yourself. What do you want to look for in a deal? We had a deal recently where owning the real estate was incredibly important for the buyer. Ultimately, having a path, not right away. It was the seller owned the real estate, and it didn't have to be right away, but the buyer, in order to move forward, needed to own the practice. The seller had these like family reasons why they needed to not sell the real estate. And so it was like, we got pretty far down the road and it was kind of like, whoa, we got a big issue.
Yeah.
Right? Like I need to buy it. You don't want to sell it. Like, how do we do this? And we were able to kind of be very practical and kind of work out a solution that worked for everyone. But that would be a great thing, I'm sure, for you to know in advance, right? As you're showing the practice to buyers or as you're kind of putting the marketing materials together for a seller so that they're not wasting their time.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's you have to understand kind of the again, that goes back to that North Star and thinking about the vision. And like, if you're going to make the transaction happen on the terms that you're most comfortable with, you have to put some thought into it on the front end and talk to all of the advisors, the attorneys, the broker, the accountant, the financial planner, to make sure that you've checked all the boxes that things are going to go down the path you want.
Do you see buyers doing a lot of that these days? Because I feel like the market, like what in your view from like the market's so competitive in certain parts of this area and the country generally, like, do you see buyers who are just like, I don't really care about the 2-car garage or this. I just want to own a practice. And then does it cause issues later on?
I think so. I haven't run into a lot of scenarios where someone compromised on the front end in terms of what they wanted from a practice, and then got to the finish line and regretted that compromise and wanted to back out. I mean, it's, it can happen, but that hasn't been like an overarching theme. I think more of what we have seen is that buyers are less willing to compromise on the front end because, and I tell sellers this all the time, the thing that has changed in the market in the last 10 years is that the opportunities for an associate to earn a great income are a lot more prevalent than they were back in the day. It used to be you worked for the private practitioner, the owner's schedule was always full first, he or she always got the big cases, and the associate got the scraps. And so it was hard to do the dental work you wanted to and to earn the income you wanted to as an associate. So I would be willing to buy the practice that had 3 chairs doing $550 in collections because I could still make more than I'm making, and I could, I knew I could grow it and all of those things, right? And so now these associates can make $250, $350, $450 as a W-2 employee because it could be a large practice and they're the only provider there, and they can work 3 chairs and they can do extractions and they get to do everything. And so they're less willing to buy some of these small practices and compromise on the front end in terms of what they're willing to buy.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So I think that's, my guess is maybe you've had some stories where because did you bring it up because maybe you've had some?
It's just
had some of those happen?
Sometimes we'll see, we'll talk to a buyer very early on in the process and they're like, I'm looking at a practice in, the Berkshires, and I'm also looking at a practice in like downtown Boston, and I'm also looking at a practice in like, a decent sized town in like New Hampshire. And it's like, well, really? Like those are very different kind of opportunities, and it just sometimes it's like we kind of we'll chuckle internally and be like, man, there's like an identity crisis going on here because it just doesn't seem like there's consistency in what they're looking for. And I always thought, and again, maybe it was a little bit too simplistic of an assumption, but I always thought it was just because the market was so hot that buyers were having to cast like a wider net than they might otherwise cast.
I think, and certainly there are exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, that type of conversation with a buyer to us is a red flag because it feels like they don't really know what they want. And, they like some buyers, I'm doing air quotes if you can't see us.
I don't think you did air quotes even if you can see us. There you go.
Buyers, for those of us, some of them like the idea of ownership, which the idea of ownership is clinical autonomy, earning more income, setting my own schedule, making decisions about the business, and eliminating the frustrations of being an employee where you don't have say on certain things. But the reality is, while those are part of the process, it is an incredible amount of work to own any business, not just a dental office. I mean, you own a small business, right? You could be an attorney somewhere and you'd work long hours, but it would be less so than you do as an owner. And so once I think people get hit with the reality of it, and we start asking them to do things, right? Everybody likes to shop for a practice, but not everybody likes to buy one because it's like, oh, well, then all of a sudden they start returning emails or they stop being proactive in the process. So
inertia.
And we'll see buyers that have been looking to buy a practice for 4 years. And it's like, oh, they just can't find the perfect practice. It's like, well, you said it earlier. It's okay to not be an owner, but like, you don't have to, keep going through the process. There's certain people that we know or we think of, we affectionately refer to them as tire kickers. We're like, yeah, I know they're inquiring at this listing, but we've been around the ring with them several times. They've never pulled the trigger. We don't trust that they would be able to complete the transaction. Like you get that reputation as a buyer, fairly or unfairly. That's the way we're trying to protect our sellers and make sure that we present them with a buyer who's serious about moving forward. And so if you have a track record of going down this path and aborting the process, whether it's pre-offer, post-offer, or, whatever it may be, you kind of, the name pops up and, we maybe let it go to voicemail.
Yeah.
So All right, we've covered a ton. I think the other piece on process that I want to touch on is, those last 2 weeks before closing can be chaotic. So if you're a buyer, plan to take vacation from your associate job, or have time where you shouldn't be seeing patients in your associate job the day before closing. You should have time you're going to need to go to the bank. You're going to need to, you're going to want to be in the practice, meeting the staff. You're going to, there's things that you're going to have to do. And if you're working from 8 to 5, it'll be a nightmare, and you'll be incredibly stressed out. So I think that's one thing that's really important. And
well, people always think, I think maybe it's becoming less and less common to think this way, but I think there's still a big portion of the community that thinks that the big time suck is closing day, right? Couldn't be further from the truth, right? On closing day, oftentimes it's just like we've exchanged like a DocuSign of a bunch of different closing documents, and you've maybe given a email confirmation that you're ready to go forward and close a deal, and then all of a sudden, as a seller, like money's in the bank account and like the deal's closed, right? It can be. I mean, we can close a deal and actually close, like capital C close, with like minimal involvement from either a buyer or a seller.
Yeah. You don't spend all day in a conference room signing 100 documents like people think, like, oh, do we got to go meet in an attorney office and have closing?
Yeah. No. They're like, it's like, do I have to take the morning off so that I can like come into your conference room and sign documents? I'm like, I didn't even know we still had a conference room. Like, we don't even use it. It's like, it's like it's a dinosaur these days. And so I think, though, to your point, what actually takes the time is the couple days beforehand, right? And look, it can be hard to like do everything in a day, right? And I think in a perfect world, if there's some ways to like create a series of like half days leading up into a closing, right? So that you can be available for multiple days, right? But maybe not the full day, but if you can be available to kind of do the things that you need to do, that would be really helpful, I think, to make sure that things go smoothly on closing day.
100%. And I think the one thing that some people forget is that, you're not buying stock in a company. You are, as a buyer, you're setting up a new company and you're buying everything the seller owns and moving it under this entity. So that means every vendor, every contract that a seller has to either be closed or transferred. And then as a buyer, you either have to open new accounts or transfer those accounts from the seller. So that is a tremendous amount of operational work. And that usually happens. It doesn't happen in, one morning. It usually happens in the week after closing. But you have to have your ducks in a row. Like, there's some of the blocking and tackling stuff that you want to have ready for closing, like payroll for the staff, right? You have an uneasy staff. The last thing you want to do as the new owner is be late with their first paycheck. You have to be able to accept payment at the front desk. If you have patients coming in, sure, there'll be some confusion and you're announcing them and there may be some uneasiness, but when people come to pay for treatment, you have to be able to accept a credit card and, bill to insurance and do some of those things. And then I think, the other piece is just, there's all these insurances and things that you're going to need to close the loan. And you have to be, again, these aren't things that like you fill out paperwork and they're done 10 minutes later. You have to talk to someone and they have to set up an appointment, and then they may have to, do a physical if it's like life or disability. And there's different things that are lead times that you can't control. And so you need to, hopefully, if you're working with someone like a broker, they've given you a checklist that can help advise you, and you're working with advisors that understand this process and know that timing matters. And you can kind of work methodically through this kind of litany of items that are needed to mechanically transition the practice to a new dentist. So, credentialing, getting your entity set up. Like, we had this particular buyer didn't hire an attorney that was local. Well, in Massachusetts, and correct me if I'm wrong, you set up your entity. It has to go to the dental board to be approved. They could be backed up and take a couple weeks. Then you can submit it to get your LLC and your articles. Then you can get your EIN. So what in some states may be a 2-day process, it could be 4 weeks if it's the wrong time of the year. Like if it's around residency and graduation where everybody's getting their license from the dental school, from the dental board, this thing can take, 6 weeks sometimes, or someone's on vacation again.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, we've had to send people to and they don't like it. They've told us not to do this anymore, but we've actually had people at our firm like go drive to the dental board and just like stand there until they got the signed document, because it's just like, it's so unpredictable. And like the last thing you want to do is let something that minute like impact when you're going to make this major life professional change of buying a practice.
Yeah. You have a 90-day notice provision in your associate contract. Well, we got to think about when you're going to communicate, because again, that's a real risk. If you tell them too early, you could end up in a very unfavorable position as a buyer. And if you tell them too late, it could really jeopardize or create a problem with the transition. And you being in the practice you just bought.
Yeah.
Or ultimately maybe moving the closing out 2 months. So, there's a number of things that go into that process that, again, whoever you're working with should hopefully be able to lay them out for you in a list and help you navigate all that stuff.
And I think it's important. I think we've kind of, in an indirect way, I think one of the big take homes that like I have from this conversation, at least, is that, people look at, a lawyer and a legal process, right? And like, it's like in a box, like you do the documents, there's legal. The reality is that there's the legal component of it is the legal component of what we do as a firm is actually pretty small in comparison to like the project management of working on a team to help move deals forward, to help make sure people are doing what they need to do. And so at the end of the day, like, it's not just about working with a lawyer who is really good at law, right? Or working with an accountant who's really good with numbers, or working with a broker who's really good at, bringing a buyer and a seller together, right? It's important to work with people who know this process, work with people who understand the practical aspects of this process, so that those pieces get managed in addition to the areas where those people specialize in.
Yeah. Yep. And I'm going to give one quick example and then we'll wrap this up. But what you just talked about, an attorney who doesn't know dental may not know that you need your entity to get credentialed for insurance if you're going to accept them in the practice. And they may not know that credentialing can take 6 to 8 weeks. And they may not know that your entity could take 3 to 4 weeks to get formed. And so all of a sudden, just by having that knowledge, your attorney may say, like yourself, if you're with someone who actively project manages, hey, I know this seems early, but we need to get your entity set up now because closing's in 8 weeks and you're going to have to get credentialed. You have to get all these things rolling. And where an attorney that doesn't know dental may say, well, listen, let's wait to create your entity until we have the APA almost done, because I don't want you to spend $300 to have your entity created and then we don't get the deal done.
Which is a perfect example of real versus perceived risk, right?
Yes.
To come full circle on the conversation, right? Like that risk of, in the grand scheme of you owning a practice for 30 years and being extremely successful, that $300 expense to set up an entity is negligible. It's nothing. It shouldn't even be talked about. We've already spent too much time talking about it, right? But what is risky, right, is like you not being able to like get money once you own the practice because you're not credentialed or you're not set up in the right way.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, this was awesome, John. A two-parter, right? So we're going to, finishing up part 2 of this episode about the process. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. John, if someone listening wants to find you, where can they track you down, either website or social or email or whatever you want to provide?
Yeah, so you can go to our website, www.eskowlawgroup.com, www.eskowlawgroup.com, and we'd love to work with you and support you in whatever journey you're trying to go down.
Awesome. Thank you again, John. This is Dave Miller from Rosen Dental Transitions. You can find us on the web and also on social at rosen.dental.transitions.com. Thank you, everyone, and we will see you next time.